Hi, it's Katrina. People abandon places for numerous reasons, often unexpectedly and not always by choice, leaving them at the mercy of wildlife and the elements. And as you're about to learn, in the absence of humans, nature eagerly reclaims its territory. Here are 8 more abandoned places taken over by nature. Number 8. Sarajevo Olympic Village. Sarajevo, Bosnia hosted the Winter Olympics in 1984. It was the first time the Games were held in a communist state. Less than a decade later, the city was ravaged by civil war, and many of the former Olympic venues were destroyed while others were abandoned. Even worse, some of these structures were repurposed for war-related uses. The Olympic Hotel was turned into a prison, and a bobsled track was used as an artillery stronghold. Today, the crumbling ruins have been largely reclaimed by nature, including the bobsled track, a disused ski jumping venue, and stands that were once occupied by spectators. Areas that lack overgrowth are instead covered in graffiti, serving as a reminder of a lingering human presence. Kosovo Stadium, where the welcoming ceremony was held, has been taken over by stray dogs. Abandoned Olympic venues are a common problem in many former host countries and cities, who often have little use for the multi-billion-dollar facilities once the Games are over. The structures are often demolished if the government can't afford it, but this isn't always the case. Meanwhile, the government also usually cannot afford or cannot justify the cost of upkeep, and the buildings are conveniently ignored. Number 7. Holland Island. Holland Island was located in the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland and was first settled in the 1600s. By 1910, it was home to a fishing community of around 350 residents. At its peak, the 5-mile-long island contained 60 homes, as well as a church, school, and post office. Holland Island lacked a rock foundation and was made of silt and mud. Erosion and rising sea levels began taking a toll on the vulnerable island in 1914, forcing residents to flee. By 1922, the island was completely abandoned. Some of the buildings, including the local church, were relocated to the mainland. Meanwhile, the island continued receding into the bay, turning from solid ground into marshland, and eventually, all that was left standing was a 2-story home. In November 2010, a storm crumbled the remaining house, and the only visible remnants of Holland Island were debris and marsh patches. By 2012, any evidence that it ever existed had completely disappeared below the water's surface. And now for number 6, but first, wanted to give a quick shout out to Lelaine Hechanova and Kimberly Montenegro for supporting this channel. Thank you so much to all of you. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell to join the Origins Explained family. Number 6. Houzouin. The former fishing village of Houzouin in China's Shengshan Island once housed around 3,000 residents, but is currently home to just a handful of people. It's the easternmost island of the 400-island Shaanxi archipelago, located about 40 miles east of Shanghai. Houzouin was largely abandoned in the early 1990s due to issues with food delivery and education. It was officially depopulated and merged with a nearby village in 2002. Today, the buildings are blanketed in vegetation. In 2015, a series of photographs of the deserted village went viral. At first, officials urged people not to visit, as Houzouin was not equipped for tourism and it could be dangerous. You could fall through a floor or something. However, slowly but surely, the village was repurposed as a tourist destination. A viewing platform was opened in 2017, and Houzouin is now open to hikers. Number 5. Valle dei Mulini. The Valle dei Mulini, or Valley of the Mills, is a cluster of abandoned mills located at the bottom of a deep crevice in Sorrento, Italy. The crumbling stone buildings date as far back as the 13th century at least, and were once part of the area's pasta production industry. They're tucked into a giant crack in the rock that was caused by a volcanic eruption in the Mediterranean 35,000 years ago, and there's a stream in the valley which not only makes it beautiful, but came in handy for powering the nearby flour mills. Other industries caught on to the stream's usefulness and set up shop at Valle dei Mulini. At one point, there was a sawmill and a laundry and wash house there. When the pasta production industry began milling flour in more industrial locations in the early 20th century, the flour mills at Valle dei Mulini became obsolete. The buildings were closed and abandoned during the 1940s. Since then, they've fallen into a state of disrepair and have been overtaken by greenery. The buildings are barely visible from afar due to the overgrowth, but it is such a magical place it attracts many visitors. Valle de Malini is a popular attraction for curious tourists and hikers, and the walk there offers stunning views of the Amalfi Coast. What's not to like? Number 4. Petite Ceinture. The Petite Ceinture, or Little Belt Railroad, loops around central Paris. From 1862 to 1934, it offered connections between main train stations and doubled as a fortification for the city. It gradually became obsolete due to urban sprawl and the implementation of the Paris Metro. Today, over 200 plant species and 70 animals occupy stretches of the abandoned railroad, and its bridges and tunnels remain intact, with the occasional signs of human visitors in the form of graffiti. Several sections of the railroad are now open to the public, including a nature trail that opened in 2008. Travel blogger Sophie Nadeau described the public walkways as an eerily silent escape in the midst of a bustling city. The remaining closed portions attract urban explorers, but aren't ideal for amateurs. Atlas Obscura warns those interested in exploring that the tunnels are dark and infested with rats, and that the terrain is rough. I mean, if you're up for the challenge, more power to you. Thankfully, people have the option of visiting certain parts of the railroad legally and more easily. Number 3. Año Nuevo Island. Año Nuevo Island is a 9-acre island off the California coast between San Francisco and Santa Cruz. From 1872 to 1948, its lighthouse station helped ships navigate along the coast. A foghorn was installed on the island following several shipwrecks near the coastline. Then, a light, keeper's quarters, dock, boathouse, and other support facilities were built. Maintaining the structures was challenging due to damage from sea air, and seals invaded both the island and its buildings, despite fences being built to prevent them from getting into yards and homes. The Coast Guard determined that the island was too expensive to maintain and ordered it closed in 1948. The facilities were replaced by a marker buoy with automatic sound, light, and radar. In 1955, the federal government sold the island to the state of California, which classified the island as a scientific preserve and banned visitors in an effort to protect breeding seal colonies. The buildings deteriorated due to the elements, and trespassers damaged and burned many of the structures. Elephants, sea lions, and birds took over the keepers' quarters, furthering the decay. Today, the island remains closed to the public and overrun by thousands of marine animals. Researchers are its only human visitors. Some of the abandoned structures still stand, but don't look that great. Number 2. Plymouth Montserrat. In 1995, the Soufriere Hills volcano in the small Caribbean island of Montserrat began erupting for the first time since the 17th century. A series of eruptions followed, with ash spewing up to 40,000 feet into the sky. The eruptions destroyed 2/3 of the island, including the capital city of Plymouth and 20 other settlements. 19 people were killed and thousands were evacuated. The eruptions continued on and off for several years. Plymouth quickly took on the eerie appearance of a ghost town, and today it's almost completely buried in ash. The rooftops poking out from the barren landscape are the city's only visible remains. Travel writer Andrew Eames described the site in an Adventure.com article, stating, "Compared to the rioting greenery of the rest of the island, the buried city comes as a shock. It is completely monochrome." Over 7,000 of the island's previous population of 12,000 inhabitants ultimately moved away, and nearly half of Montserrat remains a designated exclusion zone. The volcano has been relatively quiet since 2010, but remains active. Plymouth is still technically the capital of Montserrat despite being uninhabitable. The exclusion zone is tightly regulated, and visitation is usually not allowed for safety reasons. Anyone with permission to go there must be accompanied by police and an authorized tour guide. Number 1. Coleman Scott. Coleman Scott is an abandoned mining town in the Namib Desert of southern Africa in a region called the Forbidden Zone. In 1908, a Namibian rail worker discovered diamonds while clearing sand from railroad tracks. Soon enough, hordes of prospectors began flocking to the area, and by 1912, the town of Coleman Scott was established. At one time, 11.7% of the world's total diamond production came from Coleman Scott, where 1 million carats were mined annually. Naturally, the town was wealthy and contained luxuries not typically available in the middle of a barren desert, including a butcher, baker, post office, and ice factory, as well as fresh water brought in by train. German colonizers wanted a piece of the pie and declared Coleman Scott a restricted zone. Ordinary people were banned, and prospecting rights were reserved for a Berlin-based company. Local tribespeople worked for the mines, living in cramped on-site accommodations. In 1928, the richest ever diamond fields were discovered to the south, and by the 1930s, Coleman Scott was running out of diamonds. Workers abandoned the town, leaving their homes and even their personal belongings behind for better prospects elsewhere. Coleman Scott was completely abandoned by 1956 and has since been taken over by sand dunes, which have eerily creeped into the empty homes. The town was reopened in 2002 as a tourist attraction by a local ghost tour company. Several of the buildings in Coleman Scott are in a state of deterioration, and conservation efforts are ongoing to keep the ghost town alive. Thanks for watching! If you like this topic, be sure to check out part 1 if you haven't already. Remember to subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye!